When I was a kid, summers and New Year's meant one thing: road trips to visit family in Mexico. We'd pack the car with everything we could fit and hit the road, always sticking to the same routine. Those trips were usually uneventful, until one particular journey when I was 8 years old. As usual, we left our home in North Texas around 6 p.m., planning to drive through the night and arrive at our destination early the next morning. Around 2 a.m., we crossed the border into Mexico, and that's when things started to get strange. Driving through the desert at night is like being in a different world. There's nothing but the endless stretch of highway ahead and a vast, silent darkness around you. The stars were scattered across the sky like pinpricks of light, and the jagged outlines of cacti stood like shadowy sentinels. On a road like that, it's not unusual to see the same car behind you for miles. It's just part of the monotony, or so I thought. I wasn't fully asleep, never could quite manage that in a moving car, but I was in that in-between state, just aware enough to hear what was happening. That's why I caught it, when my mom broke the silence with my dad's name. "Miguel, that car behind us, it's been there since we left Laredo." My dad glanced at the rearview mirror, but didn't seem fazed. "It's nothing. Lots of people use this road. They're probably headed to Reynosa or somewhere close." He brushed it off easily, but my mom wasn't convinced. I could feel her unease filling the car, and it spread to the rest of us. My siblings and I, restless and curious, started peeking out through the gaps in the luggage piled high in the back to catch a glimpse of the car. We got bored of that pretty quickly, but my mom didn't let it go. "He's getting closer," she said after a while, her voice tighter now. We turned to look, and sure enough, the car had closed the gap. Too close. "He's way too close, Miguel." She wasn't wrong. By then, the car was practically tailgating us, its headlights glaring into our car like unwelcome eyes. On that dark, deserted highway, hours away from dawn, it felt ominous. We didn't have many options. My dad stayed steady. He didn't speed up, slow down, or stop. He just kept driving like everything was fine. But the car didn't waver either. It stuck to us, mile after mile, and the tension in the car grew thicker with every passing moment. The next 30 minutes were some of the most nerve-wracking of our lives. The car didn't just follow us, it toyed with us. It would ease off now and then, only to surge forward again, its headlights blazing into our rear window, like it was deliberately trying to unsettle us. It felt almost personal, like whoever was behind the wheel knew exactly what they were doing and was getting some twisted thrill out of it. During one of those brief moments when the car fell back, my mom spotted something that made her act instantly. A police car parked up ahead on the side of the road. "Pull over, right in front of the police. Pull over right now, Miguel," she demanded, her voice sharp and unyielding. Without hesitation, my dad steered our car to the side and parked directly in front of the police cruiser. The car sped past us, continuing down the road. I can only imagine how baffled the officer must have been, seeing our car abruptly pull over like that. He got out and approached us, his expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "What's going on?" he asked, peering into the car. My mom wasted no time, her words tumbling out in a rush. She told him about the car, how it had been following us, tailgating us, and how it seemed like it was trying to scare us. The officer listened carefully, his face growing serious as she spoke. "It's good you stopped," he said finally. "There have been cases of people being targeted on these highways. Criminals use tactics like that to intimidate drivers and steal their cars, or worse." His words hit us like a punch to the gut. The tension we'd been feeling turned into something heavier, something colder. But then, he added something that gave us a little relief. I'll follow you for a while, just to make sure you're safe. With the police cruiser behind us, we drove off, feeling the first flicker of safety we'd felt in hours. My dad stayed steady on the road, while my mom kept glancing back at the flashing lights in the rearview mirror, her shoulders finally starting to relax. And then, about 10 minutes later, we saw it. The car. It was pulled over on the side of the road, just sitting there, waiting. The sight of it made my stomach drop. My mom's breath hitched, and I heard her whisper, "Miguel." All right, so I'm about to share the scariest thing that's ever happened to me. Just a heads up, I'm not a native English speaker, and while I can manage pretty well, I'm not entirely confident with all the technical scuba diving terms. I'll do my best, so please bear with me. This happened last year, right between Christmas and New Year's Eve. I'm from the French Caribbean, so it's pretty normal to go scuba diving during the holidays. My family and I'm 25 by the way, had booked a few dives. They're all really skilled divers, much better than me. They've passed several advanced levels that let them do more technical dives, which I'm not certified for. I love scuba diving too, but I still stick to casual dives and always prefer having an instructor with me, especially for dives that require decompression stops. For anyone unfamiliar with scuba diving, here's a quick explanation. You can safely dive to a certain depth before pressure becomes dangerous. If you go beyond that depth, usually about 20 meters or 65 feet, you have to do decompression stops as you ascend. These stops allow your body to adjust to the pressure changes. If you ascend too quickly, you risk decompression sickness, which in the worst cases can be fatal. Since I wasn't ready to join my family on their advanced dives, we decided I'd start with a private lesson to brush up on my skills. On the first day, while my family was off enjoying a technical dive I didn't feel confident doing, I had a session with an instructor to refresh my scuba reflexes. It went well. We explored a beautiful coral reef, and I was the most experienced diver among a group of beginners on the boat. I was doing so well that my instructor paired me with a true beginner and took us both down after a safety briefing that covered all the rules and hand signals, the only way to communicate underwater. We began our descent, and it felt great. My reflexes came back quickly, and I was having fun, going back and forth between the instructor and the other diver for about 20 minutes. Everything was perfect, except for one thing. It was a windy day, and the waves were heavy. While that's not a huge issue underwater, it did mean swimming required more effort, and my air supply was depleting faster than usual. I signaled my instructor that I was running low, and he acknowledged it. It wasn't critical yet, so we continued. That's when I saw him, a young man swimming straight toward me. He wasn't the instructor or the beginner I was paired with. I hadn't seen him on the boat either, but he was fully geared up, so I assumed he must have been part of our group, and I'd just missed him earlier. He approached quickly and gave me the hand signal for an air failure. He was out of air. In scuba diving, there's a strict protocol for this kind of emergency. You help immediately. Seconds matter, because if someone loses consciousness underwater, they drown. On every diver's gear, there are 2 breathing devices, a primary regulator and a backup, often called an octopus. I handed him my backup, and for a while, we both shared my air supply, doubling the rate at which it was being used. Once he seemed calm, I tried to signal that we should go to my instructor. He shook his head, and instead, gestured for us to start ascending right away. Technically, he wasn't wrong. If I was running low on air and we were above the decompression stop level, heading to the surface was the right move. But I was confused because it would have taken only a few seconds to notify the instructor, who could have managed the ascent with us. His reluctance made me uneasy, and my air supply was draining fast. By then, my instructor had noticed us and was swimming toward us. Just as he got close, the guy let go of my backup device, switched back to his own regulator, and swam away, breathing perfectly fine on his own. I was completely thrown off, but my instructor helped me start the ascent. Once we surfaced, the waves made me feel dizzy and nauseous, so I didn't immediately bring up what had happened. It wasn't until we were back on the boat heading to shore, without the strange man, that I mentioned the encounter to my instructor. He didn't seem too concerned. Maybe he got separated from his group and needed a moment to calm down, he said. Okay, I replied. But why did he tell me he was out of air? The instructor shrugged. You probably misunderstood his hand signal. If he went back to breathing from his own device, he wasn't really out of air. I wasn't convinced. I knew what I saw, but I let it go. The next day, I joined my family for a dive with a different instructor, Charlie. I'd been thinking about the strange man and decided to ask her about him. I described what had happened and asked if she knew who he was. Oh, that's Marvin, she said. Don't worry about him. He's training to be an instructor. When he has a day off from the restaurant he works at, he likes to dive on the coral reef. We pick him up in the afternoon. I actually had lunch at his restaurant yesterday. He's fine. Hearing that eased my mind. I chalked it up to a misunderstanding and told myself Marvin was just doing his thing. For now, the incident seemed resolved. The rest of the week went by without any incidents. I kept progressing, doing more and more technical dives, and everything went smoothly. Charlie turned out to be an amazing instructor. As for Marvin, I never saw him again. At least, not until the last dive. It was New Year's Eve, and we'd planned the best dive of the week, exploring a shipwreck. I'd trained enough to feel confident doing it without an instructor, just my family and me. It was Charlie's day off, but my first day instructor was there and mentioned he'd be diving the wreck too. He assured us that he'd keep an eye on me and help if needed. That made me, and my family, feel much more at ease. The dive was deep for a beginner like me, about 30 meters at its lowest point, roughly 98 feet. But I felt ready. We descended and started exploring the wreck, weaving in and out of its hauntingly beautiful structure. I saw my old instructor twice during the dive, and each time I gave him the everything's okay sign. Then I saw him. Marvin, or at least I thought it was him, swimming toward me. At that moment, I was hovering about 5 to 10 meters above the deepest point I'd reached, still safely below the decompression stop level. I was startled, but even more surprised when he signed to me again that he was out of air. Suspicious as I was after what happened before, I couldn't take the risk of ignoring him if he was genuinely in trouble. So I handed him my spare breather. This time, I had plenty of air left, so it didn't feel like a risk. He took it, began breathing, and then grabbed my arm. I reached toward his instruments to check his air level, but he pushed my hand away. Then he gave me the signal to ascend. Immediately, I signed no. I hadn't reached my deepest point when he approached, but I had been deeper earlier in the dive and needed to do a decompression stop. Ignoring that wasn't an option. It would mean risking decompression sickness, which could kill me. I tapped my diving computer, trying to explain, but he only shrugged, smiled at me, and started pulling me upward, still gripping my arm tightly. At first, I froze. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening. Then, my diving computer started blaring at me. It was telling me I needed to stop and decompress immediately. That's when I realized the full danger. If I let him keep pulling me up, I wouldn't make it. I'd die from the bends. Panic hit me like a wave, and I began thrashing, trying to break free. I screamed out of instinct, only to remember that no one could hear me underwater. Below me, I caught a glimpse of my father and sisters. My father finally looked up and saw us, but he didn't seem alarmed.
probably because he thought the man with me was my instructor. I wriggled harder, my computer's alarms growing more insistent, when suddenly, my father's expression changed. He understood something was wrong. He swam toward us at full speed as I managed to hit the man holding me. My dad reached me, grabbing my ankle and yanking me downward. The stranger let go immediately and swam away without looking back.
My dad pulled me deeper, and we waited out an extended decompression stop to ensure I'd be safe. Then, together, we began a slow, careful ascent. When we finally surfaced, I was overwhelmed with emotion. I climbed back onto the boat, crying uncontrollably. Later, I told my dad what had happened. He admitted he thought the man was my old instructor, which was why he hadn't been alarmed at first. I told my instructor as well, and this time, he took me seriously. He told me to point out the man when he surfaced. But the man never came up. The next day, New Year's Day, we went back to the scuba diving club because my younger sisters had certificates to collect. Charlie was there, and I told her everything, still shaken. When I described what had happened, her face went pale. "That wasn't Marvin," she said. "Marvin was at the restaurant yesterday for New Year's Eve. He wasn't diving." Her words sent a chill through me. If it wasn't Marvin, then who was it? To this day, I still don't know who that man was, what he wanted, or why he seemed intent on putting me in danger, not just once, but possibly twice. This story takes place in 2016, not too far into the new year. At the time, I was cleaning houses for a small but very unique company in Seattle, Washington. Most of my experiences on the job were positive. I met some incredible people, and I loved the feeling of helping others by cleaning and organizing their spaces. Sure, the work was hard on the body, but overall, it was a pretty rewarding gig. One day, I was assigned a new client, Mark. Mark lived with some disabilities and mental handicaps in a tiny apartment, about 500 square feet, in the U District, just west of the 45th Street exit, if you're familiar with the area. His living expenses, including the apartment, utilities, and food, were covered by a combination of state assistance and an inheritance left by his late parents, managed by his brother. The apartment complex was at least 40 years old, maybe older. Each visit started with me calling Mark to come downstairs and unlock the small gate in the alley where I parked. Then, we'd ride up together in the building's ancient elevator. That elevator was something else. It took forever to arrive, and it was so small, about the size of 2 phone booths stuck together. It was tucked away in a corner, with one of those old-school metal gates that you had to slide open before the doors could move. The bell made a soft, nostalgic tink sound. The dim lighting was a faded yellow, and the floor was covered in funky yellow laminate. It definitely had a vibe. Importantly, I only ever used the elevator. I had no idea where the stairs were in the building. Mark's apartment was about 5 doors down from the elevator. The first time I met Mark was a bit of a mess. I couldn't reach him on the phone, so I had to call my company. They contacted his brother, who eventually got through to Mark. I was on the verge of packing up and leaving when I finally saw him coming to let me in. He introduced himself, and I introduced myself. Right away, I noticed something alarming. He was only wearing one shoe, and his bare foot was enormous, swollen and bruised, like someone had taken a sledgehammer to it. He dragged it behind him as he walked, and it looked incredibly painful. I later contacted my office about it to make sure his brother knew it probably needed medical attention. The apartment itself was simple but cramped. There was a small living area connected to a kitchenette, 2 tiny bedrooms, and 1 bathroom. My job was to clean only the common areas, the living room, kitchen, and bathroom. easy enough, right? But before the incident that had me bolting out of there, I'd already had plenty of experiences in that apartment that left me uneasy. Nothing dangerous, but odd enough to keep me on edge. It was the kind of unease that settles in the pit of your stomach and never quite goes away. Because of this, I was always prepared for a quick exit. I kept my keys in my apron and brought in only the gear I absolutely needed, even though it was a lot to carry. Everything was designed to be portable. Parking in Seattle is notoriously awful, so I often had to park a fair distance away and walk to the apartment. To save time, I made a habit of leaving extra bags outside the front door. Now, here are some of the odd experiences I had leading up to what I now call the day. Mark frequently asked me to make him food, usually just instant oatmeal packets. I never minded. It wasn't a big deal. It became clear pretty quickly that Mark struggled with substance abuse. I was never allowed into the bedrooms, but I'd always hear loud snoring coming from behind one of the closed doors during my visits. Occasionally, I'd walk in to find up to 7 people passed out on every available surface. Couches, chairs, even the floor. It wasn't unusual to see sex workers hanging around. The apartment was perpetually filthy. Spoiled food, heavy cigarette smoke, and clutter everywhere. One time, the place was completely trashed. The couch ripped apart, the TV smashed. You might wonder why I didn't say something. The truth is, my company was fully aware of the situation at Mark's apartment, and so was his brother. Mark had been a client for years, and I wasn't the first cleaner to take on his space. Honestly, it didn't bother me as much as you'd think. I grew up in late 90s Seattle with parents who taught me to recognize my privilege and use it to help others. Junkies, drag queens, homeless folks, and sex workers were always part of the fabric of the city I loved. Coexisting with people from all walks of life was just normal. But everything changed the day I met the Snorer. Turns out, the Snorer wasn't just a visitor. He was Mark's roommate. A large man in his late 40s or early 50s, I first saw him one morning watching Sanford and Son in the living room. That moment made everything click. Mark was letting people take advantage of him. Strangers were in and out of his apartment constantly, eating his food, crashing on his floors, and God knows what else. Add Mark's disabilities and substance abuse to the mix, and it was heartbreaking. A chaotic, sad situation I spent 2 hours a week immersed in. Then came the day. It was 10 a.m. on a crisp, sunny winter morning. Mark met me at the gate, which wasn't unusual, but this time he asked me something that caught me off guard. "Do you have kids?" he said. Mark wasn't the type to make small talk. Our conversations were always simple. Good morning, bye, and the occasional, "Can you make me food, please?" That was it. I found his question strange, but didn't see any harm in answering. "Yes, Mark, I do. I have a little one at home with her dad." He nodded. "I have a friend over, so don't go in my room." I agreed, assuming it was probably a lady friend, and followed him inside. To my surprise, the apartment was relatively clean, cleaner than I'd ever seen it. The lights were on, the blinds were open, and even the bedroom doors were ajar. Mark had a new microwave he was excited about, and seemed in an unusually good mood. I figured my office had passed along my concerns to his brother, and maybe he'd come by to help clean up. Feeling a little more at ease, I brought all my gear inside, breaking my usual rule. Then I noticed the friend in Mark's bedroom. He was a smaller guy, wearing jeans and a pullover hoodie, sitting on the edge of Mark's bed. From where I stood in the kitchen area, I could see into Mark's bedroom, the living room, and the front door. I got to work as usual, starting with the kitchen, and planning to move to the bathroom next. I was pre-spraying the toilet, shower, and sink
while scrubbing down the stove when Mark appeared behind me. He asked me to pour him a bowl of cereal. "Sure, Mark. Just give me a couple of minutes," I said, trying to sound calm. Mark turned and went back toward his bedroom, swinging the door halfway shut. It stayed ajar, though, and from the corner of my eye, I saw them sitting on the bed, freebasing something. My stomach dropped. I needed to get out of there. My keys and phone were in my bag, which was sitting in the bathroom, and my other gear was scattered around the apartment. Trying to stay calm, I kept working while formulating a plan. Then Mark came back and stood at the end of the short counter, blocking my path to the front door. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, his voice low and deliberate. "Sure, Mark," I replied, forcing a smile. "What kind of cereal are you thinking? Why don't you give me a couple of minutes and I'll bring it to your room?" My goal was simple. Get him into his room so I could grab my bag and make a run for it. But Mark didn't budge. "I am the fucking devil," he said. "I am pure evil, and you are not." My pulse was racing. "Mark, I don't think you're evil," I said carefully. "Why don't you let me go to the bathroom real quick, and I'll be right back, okay?" He stared at me for a moment, then turned and went back to his room. As soon as he did, I darted to the bathroom, grabbed my bag, and headed for the door. Before I could leave, Mark let out a scream, a deep, guttural, violent sound that froze me in my tracks. My heart was pounding as I tiptoed past the bedrooms, grabbed my cleaning caddy, and opened the front door. Behind me, I heard Mark call my name, followed by both of them laughing. It wasn't a reassuring laugh. I had no idea where the staircase was, so I ran to the elevator, the old, creaky, painfully slow elevator. I hit the button for the first floor, and time seemed to stop. My mind raced. What if he finds me here? What if I'm cornered? I heard my name again, this time from outside the elevator. Panicked, I pulled out my safety blade and grabbed a can of Comet Cleanser, ready to use it as a weapon. The elevator door finally closed. When it opened to the courtyard, I bolted. I didn't look back until I was through the gate and in my car. I locked the door, sat there shaking, and finally allowed myself to breathe. When I looked up, the door to the apartment building was closed, and no one was there. No one had followed me. I drove a couple of blocks away, parked, and broke down. I cried hard, my body shaking from adrenaline and fear. Eventually, I called my office and went in to report what had happened. They were incredibly supportive, and I stuck with the job for another 6 months without any more incidents. After that, I moved on to something else. Looking back, I can't help but reflect on how my mind processed the situation. Everything happened so fast, but I think I made the best choices I could in the moment. That said, I don't know why I was so concerned with gathering all my gear. In hindsight, I should have left everything except my bag with my phone and keys. Still, I made it out, and here I am, alive to tell the story. Cheers to that.